Hello, and in this video we will implement iteration number 6, saving to a file. The work on this iteration will take place primarily in the contact data source file. We will do some work in the contact file as well. So what needs to happen here is we need to have a function that's able to save contacts from the array. This is the array that contains all our contacts. We manage them here, and we move them, count them, add them, delete them from that array. So what we need to do is to sync that array to a file, or in other words, create a file and save the array to that file every time a change happens. In the beginning of the when the data source is created, it is initialized with a sample contact. So here in the initialization step, we will need to load the array from the file instead of getting a sample contact and creating a new array every time. So it will no longer be a new array every time. It will come from the file. So before managing the initialization process, adding a contact, deleting a contact, and moving a contact, we will need to define tasks that saves the contacts and delete and then loads the contacts from the file. So every function, we will use new functions for these tasks. So we will need to create a function to save contacts, and this function will need to retrieve the location of the file, and then as a step 1 and as a step 2 save the contacts array to the file. Then we need another function to load the contacts. I'm going to call it getContacts, and this function will load the contacts from a file and put them in the array. So the first step to this function is to retrieve the location of the file, and then in step 2 open the file and load contents into the array. But we want to do that only if the file exists, because if you try to open a file and the file doesn't exist, then you're gonna run into an error or run into a problem. So this is the 2 steps. Notice that the first step, retrieving the location of the file, is the same in both cases. Whenever you see a task that is the same and doesn't change, that's a good candidate for a separate function. This way you do not repeat code, and the code that you, if you in the future modified that code, so for instance, if the file is no longer locally on the device, it's on a server, then these 2 functions, the save and the getContact, will not change. Only the getContact will change. So I'll make another function, and this function will say get the file URL path. So this is a function that returns the path as a URL, and you're familiar with the URL from the AV Foundation, the AV Audio Player class. The function doesn't need to receive anything, but it needs to return an NS URL. This means that the last line on the function has to be returned, and it needs to return a file of type NS URL. So that's the 3 functions we need to add here. And then in the move contacts, whenever you make a change to the contact, the last step will be to save contacts back to the file. So we say save contacts. When you delete contact, then you need to save contacts as well, so that you sync the changes. When you add a contact, you also need to save contacts. So once you create a save contact, you need to save when you move, when you delete, when you add contacts. So when do you load the contacts from the array? In the initialization. Currently we initialize the contacts by initializing a sample contact. You can still do that, but every time the app loads, it will add a sample contact. You don't want that to happen. So we will comment those out. One part of getting contacts, so we'll call get contacts, and the get contacts will load the array in the here. And we are, let's see what's the issue here. So self, so the contact, let's say self.getContact, and because we are asking contact, calling a function from the particular class like this, from this particular class, we have to initialize the class, because at the time of initialize, the class is not there yet. So we will need to initialize the class by initializing its super in order for the self to exist, and then we can call a function inside the init function. So this is just a change we make here. So I actually, before even implementing the details of save contact and get contact, while I have them here as black, I already implemented them in a blank. I already implemented them in move, delete, add, and initialize. So once I finish the implementation, everything should work fine. So to retrieve the location of the file, I will get that location from the URL. So let file URL equal, well, actually I can get even the file path directly. The file path. So the file path will come from the URL, get file URL, and then have and I can retrieve from that the path of the file with an exclamation mark here at the end. And the path gives us back a string, which is what is needed in order to retrieve the content of the file. And because there was a question mark, I add the exclamation mark. Likewise, I'll need to do that again here. Get file URL path. So how do I save the array to a file? We'll use a class called NSArchiver, NSKeyedArchiver, and there's a KeyUnArchiver to retrieve to retrieve the array, and the NSKeyedArchiver in order to save it. It's basically coding and encoding the file. And as you can see here, architecture dependent format that can be stored in a file. So I say I want to use this class and use the function called archive root object. And in the archive root object, it asks you what is the root object you want to archive. So I want to archive my contacts array. And what is the name of the file? So I want to save it to the file path. That's the file I want to use. So the archive root object will require an or the NSKeyedArchiver. It's an an NSCoder implementation, which means that all the objects that will be saved need to be a key value coded. You dealt with key value before in the NS dictionary when we dealt with object was the project 3. We also dealt with the key value when we use the NS user default to key the statistics to the NS user defaults. So the same concept here. The NS mutable array is a key value enabled, but our contact, the contact class, is not. So we will need to define our contact class to be NS key value enabled. So let's do that first before we come in and implement the get contacts. So I'm going to switch to the contact class. And to make the contact class key value enabled, we implement the NSCoding protocol. As you can see here, it is a protocol, and it has two methods that a class must implement, so the instances of the class can be encoded and decoded, and this provides the basis for archiving, where you can store them on a disk and distribute them. So once you add the NSCoding protocol, it will say that there are two functions, init with coder and encode with coder. The init with coder is to retrieve the coded object from the file into your class, and encode with coder is to code your object, the contact, into the format that goes to the file. So here we'll add these two. So the init with coder, because we implemented the NS coding protocol, you can see that function as an option here, and this function receives a coder which is of type NSCoder. If you recall, back in the contact data source, the NSKeyedArchiver is an NSCoder. So the function will receive this coder which has the contact to the file, and then you need to provide how you want to use that coder. How do you want to decode the object from that coder into this class type? So the way we're going to do this is we will retrieve three codes into the first name, last name, and email. So we'll say that a decoder dot decode object for key. So we're going to save those objects into three data items with keys, and then when we decode them, we're going to decode them for the keys. So the first key will be first name, and we're going to decode this as a string and then assign it to the first name. So first name equal, and then assign it like that. Because we are going to access the first name in this step, we need to initialize the self first. So I will say here self.init. Or I can say the super. Let's finish those, because there will be an interesting thing that will happen here. And then we'll do the same for the last name. So the last name will be a decoder.decode object for key. Pay attention to first name, and this should be last name, first name and last name, because this is exactly how we want to encode it in the encode object function. And then email address will be decoder.decode object for key email address. And again as string. So now we see the init function will say that it is a required, and once you do the required, there is also well, it's settled, so we'll leave it like that. And then we have the second function called encode with coder, and this function will encode the object. So we'll say a coder.encode object for key. So we're first gonna encode the first name for the first name key. The key has to be exactly the same, similar to what we did in previous project. If you mess up the key, it will not find the object, and the code will not, there will not be error, but it will not find the object that you are looking for. And then email address. We did those steps because our contact class is not by default an NSCoding, so it doesn't know how to code it. Whereas that string is a key value object, so it can be encoded. So had we not used our own custom class, contact class, we would not have to implement the NSCoding protocol and add these two functions. But now that we did, the save contacts will work, and then the get contact also will work. We need to check that the file exists first. So to check the file exists, we will use a file manager. So let's say let file manager equal NSFileManager, and it has a default file manager that we can retrieve. Then we can ask the file manager if the file exists. So we can ask if the file exists at path. But the file manager also needs a path. So the path, we have the path here, so we'll say file path and say, does the file exist on the path or not? If the file exists, it will give us true. If the file doesn't exist, then it will give us false, and then we don't do anything. So the first step is to retrieve the contents of the file, and we'll retrieve that using the NSKeyedUnArchiver, and then say unarchive file object with file, and then provide the file path. So this will unarchive the object, which is our NS mutable array, from the file, and because the NS mutable array contains contacts, it will unarchive the contacts one at a time as well, and then put those all in this particular file that we can then add to our contacts array, add objects from array. The function add objects from array will allow you to take these objects, and we know that this is an array because we saved the array. We saved an array, so we know that this one is an array, and that will be it. Xcode is complaining here, saying that the n object is expected, and so it's saying that we have to cast the type into an array, so we'll use as any object. So we cast it to a generic type. And we forgot to cast this as NSArray, because the type will come as a generic type, so we have to cast it as an array first. And once you do that, Xcode will give you the suggestion to insert this cast as any object. So this is the how to save to a file, to encode an object to a file, and how to open the content from the file into the object. This is because we have our own custom type, and this is one of the ways where we don't have to worry about the details of the array, but rather we save them one item in the array at a time. What is left here is creating the file and getting a URL for the file. So we introduced the file manager, and the file manager has functions that allow you to check different operations of the file system. One of them is to check if a file exists in a path or not. You can also look for the NSFileManager API documentation and learn about the NSFileManager. And one of the features of the NSFileManager is that it can retrieve a URL for a directory and can create a file into that directory. So we'll see how we can do that. So the first step is to get a reference to the file manager. And now I am in the get file URL path, the last function I need to implement. So I'll say let file manager equal NSFileManager.defaultManager. Then the next step, get a reference to a directory. And we discussed in the overview, and go back and take a look at it, there are several containers or bundles or folders inside your app app sandbox, the one that you need to pick up one that will be similar or suitable for what you want to do. So I want to save here user data. But I'm saving the user data in an NS mutable array encoded format, which the user cannot really make sense out of it. It's not an audio file or an image file or a text file or a Word document or PDF that the user can retrieve through accessing the folder through iTunes. This is a user-generated data, but it's used for the purpose of supporting the application. So, so we will, if you go back to the overview, the appropriate folder for this is the application support folder that exists in the library folder. So we first get a reference to the application support directory in the app bundle. So we'll say let app support directory equal. And we go to the file manager and then access the function called URL for directory. And the URL for directory, if you look at the quick help to the right in the utility area, it throws. So it says here it throws, and if you recall back from project 4, the NS audio layer also had the throws. So whenever you see the throws, it means that it participates in the exception handling mechanism for handling errors. You can use do try catch to catch that error and handle it, or you can suppress the error and say don't throw, or that you let the error take place. So we'll bring that function. So in order to use a function like that, we'll use try with the exclamation mark to suppress the error. So the file manager URL for directory receives 3 different parameters. The first one is the directory path. You don't have to worry about finding the directory. The library has some functions that allow you to provide the name of the path you're looking for, and it will find it. So the NS search path directory, NS search path directory is an enumeration, which is a list of items which has the different directory path. And to access them, you press the dot and it gives you all the different directories that you can access inside your application. So or that you can create for your application. So I'm gonna use the application support directory. So I use NS search path directory dot application support directory. So that's the directory I want to receive a reference for. In domain, what is the domain that is searching for that directory? So NS search path domain mask specified base location for this. So our base location here is the user. So we'll say that there is a user domain mask. So we'll use the user domain mask, and then appropriate for URL, we'll use null for that. And then in the create means that if the file, if that directory did not exist, do you want to create it? So we say yes. If it exists, then it will not create. So that gives us a reference to the directory, the application support directory. Then the next step is to add our file to the directory. So we'll say that let file URL equal, and then we'll use the app support directory, and and then we need to say URL by appending path component, which allows us to append a path component. In this case, it will be a file, so we can name the file anything we want: address, book, and give it any extension that we want. I'm going to give it extension data. This is a file that will be very special. It's only available and accessible to our application, no other. So it's a format specific to our application. It's encoded using this encoder, and we will be the only one who will encode it back. So I'll give it any name and extension. And then step 4, because the function declared that it returns an NS URL, I need to return the file URL. So I say return. Anytime you use the declaration that the function returns, you need to provide the keyword return to return the URL for the function. So that's everything we need to implement. So quickly to review, in the contact class we implemented the NSCoding, and in the address book or in the data source we added 3 functions. The first function is to retrieve a file path URL. We use the file manager to retrieve a reference to the ApplicationSupport directory, and we appended a file path to that directory to give us the actual name of the file. And if the file does not exist, it will create it. If it exists, it will give you the URL. Then we retrieve the URL and use the NSKeyedArchiver in order to save the entire NS mutable array object. And because it is made of contacts, we had to implement the NSCoding for contacts. And then in the get contact, we did the same, retrieve the file path, and then retrieve the content of the file and added it to the array as different objects. The only difference here is that we added a check to make sure the file exists, just in case if the file doesn't exist, we don't load any information. In the init method, we changed that by adding a super.init to allow us to call the get contact, which is once the contact data store is created in the controller, it will load the contacts from a file. In the beginning, there will be nothing in the file, and then we add and it will save. So we modified the add contact to save after it adds to the array, or modified delete contact to save after it removes from the array. We modified the move contact to save after it replaces the object. So let's try and run. So we'll need to maybe add 3 different contacts and test that it can be deleted, add them and then close the application and open it. So it comes with nothing in it. So we'll add a contact. So I'll add a test contact. Save. And then I will close the application by Command Shift. So I'll close the application and open it again. So it initializes the file. When you open it again and you see the test contact in here, and you can see its details. Then I will add another contact. And I can edit by replacing them and close the application. Open it again, and the information comes from the file. I can delete and close the application. I press Command Shift and hit the H key twice. Or you can go to the simulator hardware and you see that in home, but you need to hit home twice and load, and this is the file that you have. So now anytime you add a contact, it will be saved in the application, and you can use it as long as the application exists in the file. And the application support is backed up by iTunes when the application is backed up. So that concludes this iteration and conclude with it module number 5. Thank you.